I have something important to share with everyone, Laurence said, gently tapping his champagne glass with a spoon. The chatter around my parents' anniversary dinner table gradually faded as all eyes turned toward my husband of 9 years. Watched his face carefully, noting the slight flush creeping up his neck, the way his gaze briefly flickered toward my younger sister Bianca, before settling somewhere above the crystal chandelier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My heart remained steady, betraying none of the knowledge I'd been carrying for the past 4 months. Kristin and I have been going through some changes, he continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. We've decided to separate and begin divorce proceedings. My mother gasped softly. My father's fork clattered against his plate. Aunt Renee placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. It's been a difficult decision, Laurence added, his practiced speech flowing smoothly. But we both feel it's for the best. We've grown apart, and sometimes that happens in marriages. I noticed Bianca staring intently at her water glass, her knuckles white around the stem. There's more, Laurence said, clearing his throat. I wanted everyone to hear this from me directly. After some time has passed and the divorce is finalized, Bianca and I plan to— Before you continue, I interrupted calmly. I think everyone should check their phones. I just sent an important email. Confusion flickered across Laurence's face. What email? I sent it right before dinner, I replied, pulling out my own phone. Everyone should have received it by now. Around the table, family members hesitantly reached for their phones. My cousin Monica was the first to open the message, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the contents. My father followed, his face darkening with each swipe of his finger. Kristin, what is this? Bianca hissed, her face draining of color, as she stared at her screen. Laurence looked increasingly uneasy as he opened his own email. What have you done? He whispered. It's just documentation, I said evenly. Something I've become quite skilled at over the past few months. As more family members read through the email, expressions transformed from shock at the separation announcement to something darker. Disappointment, anger, and disgust, directed not at me, but at Laurence and Bianca. What none of them realized, yet, was that the evidence in their inboxes represented only a fraction of what I had discovered. The full depth of the betrayal was far worse than anyone at this table, except perhaps Laurence and Bianca themselves, could possibly imagine. I'm Kristin Reynolds, 34 years old, working as a digital security consultant for financial institutions across New England. My job involves protecting sensitive information, identifying vulnerabilities, and tracking unauthorized access attempts. I'm excellent at what I do, thorough, persistent, and methodical. What I wanted was simple: a loving marriage built on mutual respect and honesty, a warm relationship with my family, and the opportunity to start the family Laurence and I had been planning for years. Standing in my way were my husband and my younger sister, who had apparently decided their happiness was worth destroying mine. The injustice wasn't just their affair. It was the elaborate scheme they had crafted, the deliberate manipulation of not only me, but our entire family. The cold calculation with which they had planned to divide our assets and redirect my inheritance. The assumption that I would play the role of oblivious wife, too trusting to question the countless inconsistencies in their story. What emails? My mother asked, confusion evident in her trembling voice as she fumbled with her phone. I've compiled some relevant information, I explained calmly. Text messages, bank statements, hotel receipts, and some particularly interesting conversations about plans for after the divorce. Laurence's face had turned ashen as he scrolled through his phone. These are private conversations, he stammered. You had no right. Private conversations about me, I corrected him. About my money, about my house, about the future you two planned to build on the ruins of mine. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I think we need an explanation," he said, his voice dangerously quiet as he looked between Laurence and Bianca. Bianca attempted her usual strategy, tears welling in her eyes as she shook her head. "It's not what it looks like," she began. "Kristin is twisting everything." "I'm not twisting anything," I replied. "The texts speak for themselves. After the divorce, we'll have it all." "Your words, Bianca, sent to my husband 3 weeks ago while I was making dinner for both of you downstairs." The room fell silent, except for the sound of more phones chiming as family members opened attachments, and followed links to the evidence I had meticulously compiled. "You plan to announce this tonight," I continued, my voice steady. "You choreographed this moment to control the narrative. The amicable separation, the reasonable division of assets, the surprising but ultimately acceptable new relationship, after an appropriate waiting period. You just didn't expect me to have a narrative of my own." My cousin Stephen let out a low whistle as he reached a particularly damning exchange. "Jesus Christ, Laurence, you were planning to contest the prenup? By claiming Kristin was unfaithful? With fabricated evidence?" My mother's hand flew to her mouth as she finally managed to open the email. "Bianca, how could you do this to your sister?" It was happening, the shift in perception I had worked for months to achieve. The careful rewriting of their meticulously constructed fiction. Laurence attempted damage control, his professional charm surfacing as he tried to regain command of the situation. "Everyone, please. This is clearly Kristin's way of processing a difficult transition. Some of these messages are being taken completely out of context." "Stop talking," my father interrupted, his voice ice cold. "The screenshots show the full conversations. There is no context that makes this acceptable." Bianca shifted to tears, her go-to response when confronted. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she sobbed. "It just happened. You can't control who you fall in love with." "According to your texts," Monica interjected, holding up her phone, "you've been planning this for over 2 years. That's not just happening." I remained silent, watching the natural consequences unfold. After months of investigation, documentation, and preparation, there was nothing more I needed to say. The evidence spoke for itself. Clear, irrefutable, and devastating. I met Laurence Whitaker at a cybersecurity conference in Boston 10 years ago. I was presenting a workshop on financial data protection. He was attending as the newly appointed CFO of a regional banking group. While most attendees' eyes glazed over during my technical demonstrations, Laurence asked insightful questions that showed genuine interest. "Most people think security is just about keeping bad actors out," he commented at the reception afterward, handing me a glass of wine. "But you approach it differently, protecting what matters most by understanding its value first." His observation struck me. In an industry focused on barriers and defenses, Laurence immediately grasped the core of my philosophy. To protect something effectively, you must truly understand its worth. We married 11 months later in a ceremony at my parents' lakeside property in Vermont. Those early years were magical. We bought a Victorian home in a historic district of Hartford and spent weekends restoring its original features. Laurence's work often required travel, but he always returned with thoughtful gifts and stories. I built my consulting business, gaining recognition for developing security protocols that major financial institutions would eventually adopt. "We're a power couple," Laurence would joke, but with unmistakable pride. "The man who manages money and the woman who keeps it safe." When people asked about our success, I attributed it to communication and trust. We maintained separate bank accounts, but shared financial goals. We respected each other's independence while building a life together. I believed we had achieved that rare balance of passion and partnership, desire and friendship. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Looking back, I see how my professional training both helped and hindered me. I was skilled at identifying external threats, but had blind spots for vulnerabilities closer to home. Bianca had always been the family wild card. 5 years younger than me, she approached life as if stability were a disease to be avoided at all costs. She dropped out of college twice, cycled through relationships seasonally, and changed career aspirations monthly. Yet her charm was undeniable. She possessed a spontaneity and passion that drew people to her. "You're the responsible one, I'm the fun one," she'd tell me, as if these identities were fixed and complementary rather than limiting. Growing up, I'd been both protective and occasionally resentful of my sister. I covered for her mistakes, loaned money I knew would never be repaid, and defended her choices to our increasingly frustrated parents. In return, she brought an unpredictability to my life that I secretly enjoyed from the safety of my structured existence. When Bianca's apartment flooded 3 years ago, I didn't hesitate to offer our guest room. "It'll just be for a few weeks," she promised, dragging suitcases filled with damp clothes into our meticulously organized home. Laurence was surprisingly amenable. "Your sister keeps things interesting," he said, after Bianca's first week with us when she convinced us to abandon our usual Friday night routine for an impromptu jazz club outing. Those weeks stretched into months. Bianca found work at an art gallery but claimed Hartford's rental prices were beyond her budget. I didn't mind the extended stay. After years of geographic distance, I welcomed the chance to rebuild our adult relationship. Having her around seemed to energize our household, disrupting routines that had perhaps become too comfortable. "You two seem to be getting along well," my mother observed during a Sunday visit, watching Laurence and Bianca debate wine selections for dinner. "He's practically her brother now," I replied confidently. "It's nice that they're friends." My mother nodded, though something in her expression gave me pause, a momentary hesitation I later wished I had questioned. The signs were there, had I been willing to see them. Laurence began suggesting I accept more out-of-town clients. "Your business is ready to expand," he encouraged, "and you deserve national recognition for your work." Bianca developed an interest in finance, asking Laurence for advice with unprecedented frequency. They shared inside jokes I wasn't part of. Conversations sometimes ceased when I entered rooms. "Laurence has been so helpful with my investment portfolio," Bianca mentioned casually. "Did you know he's brilliant at explaining complex financial concepts? You're lucky to have such a patient husband." I was lucky, I thought. My successful, attentive husband had embraced my sometimes difficult sister, helping her gain financial literacy, something our parents had failed to instill. Our home felt more vibrant with Bianca's presence. If Laurence occasionally seemed distant, I attributed it to work stress. If Bianca sometimes watched him with unusual intensity, I dismissed it as admiration. Even after she finally moved into her own apartment downtown, Bianca remained a fixture in our lives. Sunday brunches, impromptu shopping trips, calls for advice that Laurence was mysteriously always available to provide. "Don't you think Bianca relies on Laurence a bit much?" My friend Esme asked after witnessing 3 calls during our lunch. "I wouldn't be comfortable with my sister having that kind of access to my husband." I laughed it off. "Bianca's just finding her footing. Besides, it's Laurence. He helps everyone." The implication was clear. Laurence would never betray me. He was too principled, too devoted, too invested in our shared future. If he sometimes received texts that made him smile in a way I rarely inspired anymore, I told myself not to be paranoid. If he and Bianca occasionally exchanged glances I couldn't interpret, I assured myself it was coincidence. Trust, after all, was our foundation. In our professional lives, both Laurence and I understood that security breaches rarely announce themselves. They begin with small anomalies, a slight deviation from patterns, an insignificant access from an unexpected location, a minor inconsistency in the data. It's only in retrospect that these signals reveal themselves as warnings. As a security expert, I knew this. As a wife, I chose to ignore the alerts flashing in my peripheral vision, silencing the alarms that suggested my most precious asset, my marriage, had already been compromised from within. The discovery came not through suspicion but through routine. 4 months ago, I was working from home, analyzing a potential security vulnerability for a client. My laptop battery died unexpectedly, and rather than wait for it to recharge, I grabbed Laurence's tablet from the coffee table to continue my work. When I opened the browser, it automatically restored his previous session, including his text message interface that he had synced to the device for convenience. I wasn't looking for anything. I had no reason to snoop. But there it was. A conversation with Bianca displayed prominently on the screen. "Miss you already," Bianca had written just 30 minutes earlier, after leaving our house following Sunday. Brunch. Last night was incredible. Still can't believe we almost got caught when Kristin came home early. Laurence's response made my blood freeze. Worth the risk. After the divorce, we'll have it all. Just need to be patient for a few more months until everything's in place. I sat motionless, staring at the exchange. My trained mind immediately began cataloging details, the timestamp indicating this was a continuation of an ongoing conversation. The casual tone suggesting an established relationship, the reference to "after the divorce" revealing premeditation. Most chilling was the phrase, "we'll have it all," implying that all included assets that were rightfully mine. With mechanical detachment, I scrolled through their message history. The texts stretched back 18 months. 18 months of deception conducted beneath my roof, behind my back, often while I was just rooms away. The messages ranged from explicitly sexual to coldly practical, discussing how to structure the divorce to maximize their financial outcome. Kristin's inheritance from her grandparents could be accessible if we time this right, Laurence had written 3 weeks earlier. Her grandmother's health is declining, and that trust becomes available to spouses after 10 years of marriage. "Can we contest the prenup?" Bianca had asked. "Working on it. I've been documenting emotional neglect and setting up a narrative about her prioritizing work over marriage. With the right evidence, we can make a case." I closed the tablet without altering anything. When Laurence came home that evening, I searched his face for signs of the stranger I'd discovered. Some indication that the man who kissed my forehead and asked about my day was actively plotting my financial and emotional devastation. But he looked exactly as he always had. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing my quietness at dinner. "Just a challenging client situation," I replied, watching him carefully. How easily the lie came to both of us now, how comfortably he moved, through our home, our marriage, while maintaining this elaborate deception. Over the next few days, I oscillated between numbness and rage. I would wake at 3 a.m., heart racing, mentally calculating how long the affair had been happening. During work hours, I functioned on autopilot, securing other people's assets while my own life had been thoroughly breached. I didn't confront them immediately. A part of me hoped for an explanation. Perhaps the messages were a terrible joke. Perhaps they weren't as damning in full context. Perhaps there was some interpretation that wouldn't demolish 9 years of marriage and a lifetime of sisterhood, but professional habits die hard. I began documenting, almost unconsciously at first. I noted when Laurence claimed to be working late, but his location showed elsewhere. I logged his and Bianca's accidental encounters that occurred with statistical impossibility. I matched credit card statements with hotel bookings and restaurant charges. The evidence mounted, irrefutable and heartbreaking. Not only were they having an affair, but they had developed an intricate financial strategy to leverage my assets, my inheritance, and even my professional reputation in their future plans. 2 weeks after my initial discovery, I sat in my car, outside an upscale hotel in downtown Hartford, watching Laurence and Bianca enter together. They were laughing, his hand placed possessively at the small of her back. I took photos methodically, adding them to my growing file. That night, Laurence came home late, claiming a budget emergency had kept him at the office. I nodded, served him reheated dinner, and listened to his elaborate fiction about reconciling discrepancies in quarterly projections. "You look tired," I said, studying the faint smudge of lipstick on his collar. Bianca's signature shade. "It was intense," he agreed, reaching for my hand across the table. "But I'm home now." The tenderness of the gesture nearly broke me. In that moment, I realized I was living with a perfect stranger, someone capable of touching me with apparent affection, while calculating how to dismantle my life. The sister I had protected and supported was equally foreign to me now, revealed as someone who could smile in my home while coveting everything in it, including my husband. I withdrew my hand gently. "You should get some rest." That night, as Laurence slept beside me. I made my decision. I wouldn't confront them yet. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of my tears or rage. I would continue gathering evidence, building my case with the same methodical precision I applied to my professional work. And when the time came to reveal what I knew, it wouldn't be in private where they could manage the narrative. It would be public, irrefutable, and completely on my terms. For the next 3 months, I lived a double life. During the day, I was Kristin Whitaker, devoted wife and loving sister. I maintained our home, participated in family gatherings, and continued the routines of my marriage with robotic precision. At night, I became an investigator in my own life, meticulously documenting the web of deception that surrounded me. The more I uncovered, the more elaborate their scheme proved to be. They had established a joint investment account funded partly with money Laurence had gradually diverted from our savings. They had consulted with a divorce attorney who specialized in contesting prenuptial agreements. Most disturbing, they had begun subtly undermining my professional reputation in our social circle, with Laurence occasionally mentioning his concerns about my work-related stress and Bianca expressing worry about my increasingly paranoid security perspectives. I realized their plan was comprehensive, not just to leave me, but to take as much as possible and ensure I would be viewed as the unstable, work-obsessed wife whose emotional neglect had driven her husband into her sister's understanding arms. The calculated cruelty was breathtaking, and I knew that traditional confrontation would never be enough to counter such a carefully orchestrated betrayal. My first instinct was to consult with a divorce attorney immediately, but professional caution prevailed. Before making any legal moves that would alert Laurence, I needed to fully understand what I was facing. I scheduled a consultation with Roman Berg, a forensic accountant who specialized in high-conflict divorces. I presented my findings without emotional context. "I need an objective assessment of these financial patterns," I explained, spreading statements and transaction records across his desk. "I want to understand exactly what's happening before I decide how to respond." Roman reviewed the documents with practiced efficiency, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. After an hour, he leaned back in his chair with a troubled expression. "This is systematic," he said, tapping a finger on a particularly damning bank statement. "These aren't impulsive withdrawals or one-time indiscretions. There's a pattern of gradually increasing financial separation that suggests premeditation." "How bad is it?" I asked, maintaining my composure. Roman's assessment was detailed and grim. Laurence had been strategically repositioning our assets for over a year. Individual transactions were small enough to avoid immediate notice, but collectively represented a significant diversion of funds. More concerning were his recent inquiries about my family's trust structures and the timing provisions in our prenuptial agreement. "The good news," Roman concluded, "is that you've caught this before the endgame. The movement suggests they were building toward something significant, likely timed around your upcoming 10th anniversary, which would have implications for how certain assets are treated in Connecticut divorce law." I left Roman's office with a clearer picture of the financial dimensions, but increasingly troubled by the personal ones. The level of calculation involved suggested this wasn't just an affair that had spiraled out of control. It was a deliberate, long-term strategy to maximize gain at my expense. My next step was more difficult. I needed to understand if others had noticed what I had missed, if the betrayal was as invisible to everyone else as it had been to me. I arranged lunch with Esme, my closest friend since college and one of the few people who knew both Laurence and Bianca well. Meeting at a restaurant far from our usual haunts, I asked carefully neutral questions about how she perceived my marriage and my relationship with my sister. Esme hesitated, stirring her iced tea with uncomfortable focus. "I've wanted to say something for months," she finally admitted. "But I didn't have proof, just observations. And you seemed so confident in both of them." The confirmation stung worse than I had anticipated. "What observations?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tightening in my chest. Esme described moments I had missed or dismissed, Laurence's hand lingering on Bianca's back at a dinner party, their synchronized arrivals and departures at social events, the way Bianca often seemed to know details about Laurence's schedule that even I wasn't aware of. "At New Year's Eve," Esme said reluctantly, "when you went to help Mac with the wine bottles in the cellar, they didn't realize I was on the deck. They were in the side garden, and they were definitely not acting like in-laws." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "You're the most competent person I know," Esme replied. "I thought if there was something to see, you'd see it. And when you didn't say anything..." She shrugged helplessly. I started to doubt what I'd observed. I told myself I was misinterpreting things. Her words crystallized something important. My reputation for capability had actually worked against me. People who might have warned me assumed I either already knew or had determined there was nothing to know. "Are people talking about it?" I asked directly. Esme winced. "Not maliciously, but yes. There have been speculations, especially since Bianca started dropping hints about major life changes coming soon." The public dimension of the betrayal added another layer of humiliation. While I had been obliviously maintaining our image as the ideal couple, my husband and sister had been laying groundwork for the revelation of their relationship, managing perceptions before I even knew there was a narrative to control. Over the next week, I had similar conversations with other trusted friends, carefully framing my questions to avoid revealing what I knew. The pattern that emerged was consistent and devastating. Most had noticed concerning interactions but hesitated to approach me without concrete evidence. Some assumed I had an arrangement given my frequent work travel. Others thought I was in denial. No one had been willing to risk our friendship by raising unsubstantiated concerns. The most painful insight came from my mother during a carefully orchestrated private lunch. "Kristin," she began after I casually mentioned Bianca and Laurence's close relationship, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you about them." My heart raced, wondering if she had somehow discovered what I now knew. "What about them?" My mother looked uncharacteristically uncertain. "Have you noticed any unusual closeness? The way they sometimes seem to communicate without words, or how Bianca always sits next to Laurence at family gatherings." I kept my expression neutral. "They've become good friends. That's natural after all these years, isn't it?" My mother placed her hand over mine. "6 months ago, I saw them together at the Parkview Hotel. It was the afternoon you were in New York for that security conference. They didn't see me. I was meeting friends for lunch in the restaurant. They were checking in together." She squeezed my hand. "I've been trying to find a way to tell you, but I wasn't completely sure what I saw meant what I thought it meant, and I couldn't bear to hurt you without certainty." The revelation that my own mother had been carrying this knowledge, uncertain how to proceed, underscored the extensive impact of their deception. It wasn't just my marriage being undermined. It was an entire network of relationships damaged by the lies they had forced everyone to navigate. "I appreciate you telling me," I said carefully. "I've had concerns for a while now." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "What are you going to do?" It was the question I had been asking myself for weeks. The traditional confrontation, tears, accusations, dramatic exits seemed inadequate given the scope of their betrayal. They had crafted an elaborate fiction. A simple emotional response would only play into their narrative of me as unstable and irrational. "I'm going to handle it my way," I told her. "But when I do, I'll need you to trust me, even if you don't immediately understand my approach." My mother studied my face, seeming to recognize something in my expression that reassured her. "You've always been methodical, even as a child. Whatever you decide, I know it will be well considered." As I collected these perspectives, a clearer picture emerged. Laurence and Bianca's betrayal wasn't just personal. It was social, financial, and familial. They had created an alternative reality that was beginning to solidify in our communities. Perception. Their strategy extended beyond the affair itself to the management of its inevitable discovery. I realized that any response would need to be equally comprehensive. This wasn't just about exposing their infidelity. It was about reclaiming the narrative they had been carefully constructing without my knowledge. The question wasn't whether to confront them, but how to do so in a way that would dismantle their entire fabrication at once. Laurence and I met during a transitional period in both our lives. I had recently established my consulting business after 5 years at a major cybersecurity firm, while he was pivoting from commercial banking to financial leadership in the private sector. Perhaps that shared sense of reinvention created a bond. We were both shedding past identities and stepping into new possibilities. Our courtship was swift but not impulsive. We discovered complementary perspectives. My detail-oriented analytical approach balanced by his big-picture strategic thinking. Where I saw potential security breaches, he saw opportunities for calculated risks. Our differences created a dynamic that felt both challenging and supportive. "You make me think differently," he told me after an early dinner debate about risk assessment. "Most people in finance think linearly, but you see patterns I miss." Those early months were characterized by deep conversations and ambitious plans. We mapped out our future with spreadsheets and timelines, where we would live, how we would balance careers, when we would start a family. There was an intoxicating certainty to our compatibility, as if we had discovered a mathematical proof of successful partnership. Our wedding reflected this pragmatic romance, intimately scaled but meticulously planned, held at my parents' lakeside, property with just 60 guests. Bianca served as my maid of honor, visibly uncomfortable in her tailored emerald dress after years of bohemian fashion. She seemed genuinely happy for me, if somewhat bewildered by my choice of a structured, conventional life. "Are you sure about all this?" she asked as she helped me with my veil. "It's so permanent." "That's the point," I laughed. "Permanence is underrated." Laurence and Bianca had limited interaction during those early years. She was geographically distant, moving between Colorado, Oregon, and briefly Montreal, pursuing various creative ventures that inevitably dissolved. Her appearances at family gatherings were sporadic, her relationships transient, her financial situations perpetually precarious. Whenever she called with another crisis, I helped without hesitation. Wire transfers for overdue rent, airline tickets when she needed to relocate, hours of emotional support when another relationship ended. Laurence was supportive of these interventions, though occasionally questioned their effectiveness. "You're treating symptoms, not causes," he observed after I paid Bianca's utility bills for the 3rd time in a year. "She needs to develop financial responsibility." "She's finding her path," I defended her. Not everyone can map their life out at 25 like we did. Looking back, I recognized an irony in these exchanges. I had interpreted his concerns as financial prudence rather than what they likely were. Irritation that resources that could potentially be his were flowing to someone he viewed as an economic liability. The dynamic among us changed significantly 3 years ago when Bianca moved back to Hartford after a particularly difficult breakup in Portland. The apartment flooding that precipitated her temporary move into our home might have been the catalyst, but I now understood it was merely a convenient opportunity in a longer-term strategy. Initially, Laurence maintained a polite distance, occasionally commenting on Bianca's chaotic habits or impulsive decisions. Gradually, this detached tolerance evolved into active interest. He began offering financial advice, then career guidance, eventually investing hours helping her establish a structured plan for stability. "I've never seen this side of you," I remarked, genuinely pleased by his engagement with my sister's problems. "You're really helping her." "Sometimes outsiders see solutions family members can't," he replied. "Besides, she's important to you, which makes her important to me." Their apparent friendship developed against the backdrop of our increasingly routine marriage. By our 7th anniversary, we had settled into comfortable patterns. Our conversations, once wide-ranging and intellectually stimulating, had narrowed to logistics and schedules. Physical intimacy had become less frequent, often initiated out of habit rather than desire. I attributed these changes to natural evolution, the transition from passionate beginnings to sustainable partnership. When I occasionally suggested rekindling our earlier intensity, Laurence would agree enthusiastically, but follow through inconsistently. Weekend getaways would be postponed due to work emergencies. Date nights would include last-minute invitations to Bianca or other friends, transforming intimate evenings into social gatherings. "We have our whole lives for alone time," he would say when I expressed disappointment. "It's important to maintain our social connections, too." Meanwhile, my relationship with Bianca seemed to strengthen. She sought my advice more frequently, shared details of her dating life, and expressed genuine interest in my work. She began describing me to others as her best friend, not just a sister, a characterization that touched me deeply after years of emotional distance. "I finally understand why you live the way you do," she told me during a sister's lunch. "There's something powerful about building something lasting." I interpreted these changes as personal growth, my impulsive sister finally recognizing the value of stability, my sometimes distant husband developing familial connections beyond our marriage. I saw us evolving into the extended family structure I had always envisioned, with strong bonds among all members rather than just paired relationships. What I couldn't see then was the calculated realignment taking place beneath these surface changes. Bianca wasn't embracing my lifestyle. She was studying it to determine how to extract what she valued while discarding what she didn't. Laurence wasn't extending himself familially. He was establishing a parallel relationship that offered excitement, without responsibility. The financial infrastructure of our lives during this period reflected similar misleading patterns. While maintaining joint accounts for household expenses, Laurence and I had always kept separate primary accounts, a structure that matched our values of partnership with independence. This arrangement, initially designed to respect our individual autonomy, ultimately facilitated his deception by normalizing separate financial activities. As my consulting business grew, requiring more travel and longer hours, I delegated increasing household financial management to Laurence. He handled investment decisions, tax planning, and property matters with apparent transparency, providing regular updates that I reviewed with diminishing scrutiny as trust compounded over the years. "You focus on building your business," he encouraged. "I'll make sure our foundation remains solid." This division seemed logical, playing to our respective strengths while maintaining shared goals. In reality, it created information asymmetry that he exploited with growing boldness. Small discrepancies in investment returns, subtle shifts in asset allocations, gradual changes in spending patterns, all were subsumed within the complexity of our overall financial picture, visible in retrospect but easily missed during periods of professional intensity. By the time Bianca moved into her own apartment downtown, a move I now recognized was strategically timed rather than financially motivated, the groundwork had been laid. Their relationship had been established, their financial coordination initiated, and their narrative constructed. My sister, once the family's unpredictable element, had been repositioned as stabilizing and supportive. My husband, once defined by pragmatism and reliability, had developed a previously unseen spontaneous side. And I had been recast from accomplished professional to neglectful wife, from supportive sister to controlling influence, from perceptive, security expert to oblivious victim, all without realizing the transformation was occurring. The transformation from suspicion to certainty wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a gradual accumulation of evidence. After discovering the text messages on Laurence's tablet, I began paying attention to patterns I had previously dismissed, applying my professional observational skills to my personal life with disturbing results. The first layer was logistical, tracking. The increasing frequency of their coincidental meetings. Laurence's banking association meetings mysteriously aligned with Bianca's gallery events. His weekend runs routinely took him past her neighborhood coffee shop. Her car would appear in our driveway minutes after I left for out-of-town client visits, sometimes before my plane had even taken off. I installed a discreet security system in our home, ostensibly for protection during my frequent absences. The footage revealed Bianca's visits while I traveled, arriving with overnight bags, leaving the following morning in different clothes. Once, I watched remotely as they cooked dinner in our kitchen, dancing to our wedding playlist, drinking from the anniversary wine glasses Laurence's parents had given us. The second layer was financial, tracing the movement of resources with growing precision. I discovered Laurence had opened a separate checking account 13 months earlier, gradually transferring small amounts from our joint savings. The cumulative sum wasn't immediately alarming, but the pattern was telling. Transfers increased, in frequency and amount as my business travel intensified. More concerning was his systematic exploration of my financial structures. He had requested copies of my grandmother's trust documents from our estate attorney, claiming we needed them for retirement planning. He had discussed hypothetical scenarios with our financial advisor about contested divorce settlements in cases with prenuptial agreements. Most disturbingly, he had contacted my business insurance provider inquiring about policy transfers in the event of significant personal changes. Laurence Whitaker called again about your liability coverage, my insurance agent mentioned during a routine renewal call. He seemed particularly interested in how a divorce might impact your business valuation. I assumed you were aware. I murmured something non-committal, adding another piece to the increasingly troubling puzzle. The third and most painful layer was social, recognizing how they had been reshaping our community's perceptions. At a dinner party, I overheard a colleague's wife mention to another guest that Laurence had such patience with my work schedule. At my parents' anniversary celebration, a family friend asked if I was feeling better after the difficult time Laurence had vaguely referenced. My college roommate emailed asking if I wanted to talk about the marriage challenges Bianca had alluded to during their lunch. They were constructing a public narrative of our disintegrating marriage, one where my career focus had created distance, where Laurence had tried valiantly to maintain connection, where concerned family members had intervened with support. The story was being written and distributed chapter by chapter, establishing context for the conclusion they planned to unveil. Most calculated was their manipulation of my parents. Under the guise of planning a surprise anniversary vacation for us, Laurence had multiple private conversations with my father about accessing my trust fund allowance in advance. Bianca had casual lunches with my mother where she would gently mention concerns about my increasing work stress and emotional withdrawal. "Mom mentioned you've seemed distant lately," Bianca remarked during a sister's shopping trip. "Is everything okay?" Between you and Laurence. Everything's fine, I replied automatically, not yet aware I was responding to a line in their script. Work has been demanding, but we're solid. That's good, she said, squeezing my arm with performative affection. Because I worry sometimes. He seems lonely when you're traveling so much. These conversations took on new meaning in retrospect. Not expressions of concern, but calculated placements of doubt, designed to make their eventual relationship seem like an organic response to my implied neglect rather than the cause of it. As my awareness grew, I began testing boundaries, creating opportunities for them to reveal themselves without realizing my intent. I mentioned considering a reduction in work travel to observe Laurence's reaction. Momentary panic quickly masked by enthusiastic support. I suggested Bianca join us for a weekend at our lake house, noting how quickly they established separate activities that allowed private time together. I discussed my grandmother's declining health and the potential inheritance, watching their exchanged glances with newly perceptive eyes. We should discuss updating our wills, I told Laurence casually one evening. With Grandma's situation and potential changes to our estate, it seems prudent. Absolutely, he agreed too readily. I've actually been researching some options already. I'm sure you have, I thought, maintaining my neutral expression. The most definitive confirmation came from their growing carelessness, the inevitable result of extended deception. Confidence in their narrative led to smaller mistakes, a receipt for a hotel room service order showing 2 breakfast settings when Laurence claimed to have been alone on a business trip. A text message Bianca sent me clearly intended for him, matching scratches on their watches from a bathroom countertop unique to a local boutique hotel. Their phones became particularly revealing. Once I began paying attention, I noticed they had both established identical usage patterns, devices always face down, password protected with biometrics, notifications disabled, frequent charging in separate rooms during family gatherings. Most telling was their coordination. One would check their phone, and within minutes, the other would find reason to step away and do the same. 6 weeks into my investigation, I made a critical discovery while organizing tax documents in our home office. Hidden beneath legitimate financial statements was a draft separation agreement Laurence had apparently been developing with legal consultation. The document outlined a proposed division of assets heavily weighted in his favor, citing my prioritization of career over marriage and emotional abandonment as justifications for overriding certain prenuptial provisions. Most shocking was the timeline. The document was dated for completion just after my grandparents' trust was scheduled to make its decennial distribution, an event that would significantly increase my assets subject to potential claims. The legal strategy relied heavily on establishing a pattern of neglect that had supposedly driven Laurence to seek emotional support from family members during my absences. The comprehensive nature of their deception became increasingly clear. This wasn't just an affair. It was a coordinated campaign to maximize financial gain while controlling social perception. They weren't just betraying my trust. They were weaponizing it, using my belief in our marriage as the very tool to dismantle it on their terms. As my evidence mounted, I found myself evaluating potential responses with the same analytical rigor I applied to security vulnerabilities. A direct confrontation would trigger their prepared narratives and defensive strategies. Legal preemption might protect some assets, but wouldn't address the broader deception. Silent departure would leave their version of events unchallenged in our social and family circles. What I needed was an approach that would expose the full scope of their duplicity simultaneously, revealing not just the affair, but the calculated nature of their entire enterprise. I needed to dismantle their narrative so completely that no alternative interpretation would be possible. The answer came as I reviewed security protocols for a banking client, specifically the section on coordinated responses to sophisticated intrusions. The most effective defense against complex attacks, I had written, was comprehensive exposure. of all compromise vectors simultaneously, leaving no avenue for the attacker to maintain position. I would apply the same principle to my personal security breach. I would document everything, connect all patterns, and reveal the complete picture at once, not just to them, but to everyone they had been manipulating as part of their scheme. The revelation that crystallized everything occurred 7 weeks ago on what should have been an ordinary Thursday. I was reviewing financial documents for a client's security assessment while working from home. A notification appeared on my laptop. Our shared cloud storage had been updated with new tax preparation files. Opening the folder out of habit, I noticed a subfolder I didn't recognize labeled Property Assessments. Inside were photographs of houses. Not just any houses, but properties in Vermont near my parents' lake home. Properties that Laurence and I had never discussed purchasing. The most recent addition was a lakefront cottage with extensive gardens and a private dock. What caught my attention wasn't the property itself, but the document attached to it. A preliminary purchase agreement with both Laurence and Bianca listed as potential buyers. The timing specified was contingent on resolution of existing obligations, with a target date just after our 10th anniversary. They weren't just planning their relationship, they were literally building their future home within view of my family's property, using funds that would partially come from the dissolution of our marriage. I sat motionless, staring at the screen, experiencing what security professionals call scope comprehension, the moment when individual data points suddenly reveal the full extent of a system compromise. This wasn't opportunistic betrayal. It was architected replacement, a complete life transfer, rather than merely a relationship exchange. That evening, when Laurence came home, I watched him with new clarity. His behavior followed the precise pattern I had documented over months, checking his phone in the garage before entering, casual inquiries about my upcoming travel schedule, vague mentions of banking events he needed to attend. The performance was flawless because it had been rehearsed through hundreds of previous iterations. "Anything interesting happened today?" I asked during dinner, my voice betraying nothing of my discovery. "Just the usual meetings," he replied, reaching for his wine glass. "The Davidson account is proving more complicated than expected. Might need to work late tomorrow to sort it out." I nodded sympathetically, knowing from my monitoring that the Davidson account was code he and Bianca used for their planned evening together. The casualness of his deception was almost impressive. Not even a flicker of tension crossed his face as he delivered the prepared lie. "That's a shame," I said. "I was thinking we might drive up to the lake this weekend, but if you're swamped with work." A momentary hesitation, the first break in his performance. "The lake? Any particular reason?" "Just feeling nostalgic," I replied, watching him calculate his response. "It's been months since we've been up there." "Let me see how tomorrow goes," he said, recovery already complete. "I'd love to go if I can wrap things up in time." Later, as he showered, I checked his phone using the backup access I had established weeks earlier. Within minutes of our conversation, he had texted Bianca, "Change of plans. Kay wants lake weekend. We'll create conflict tomorrow to avoid." Her response came immediately. "Too risky. Parents might be there. Stick with work excuse and meet at my place instead." Their coordination was seamless, their contingency planning automatic. They had been operating this way for so long that deception had become their default communication mode. What struck me most was the complete absence of guilt or hesitation. In their exchange, there was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, only tactical adjustments to maintain their cover. This final discovery shifted something fundamental in my approach. Until this moment, part of me had been gathering evidence to understand what had happened, to confirm my suspicions and quantify the betrayal. Now, with absolute clarity about the scope and nature of their plans, my focus changed entirely to strategic response. I no longer needed more information. I needed the perfect moment to use what I already knew. That weekend, While Laurence was supposedly working on the fictional Davidson account, I met with Stephen Turner, a digital forensics specialist I had collaborated with on several corporate cases. I brought copies of my evidence, carefully organized by type and timeline. "This is comprehensive," Stephen remarked as he reviewed the files. "Most people bring me suspicions and ask me to find evidence. You've brought me a complete case." "I need verification that everything is admissible and properly documented," I explained. "And I need backup copies secured where they can't be accessed or altered." Stephen reviewed the material with professional detachment, occasionally asking technical questions about how certain information had been obtained. After several hours, he looked up with something approaching professional admiration. "You've built a digital audit trail that would stand up in any court," he said. "The timeline consistency alone is remarkable. You could teach my forensics students a thing or two about documentation." "Is there anything missing?" I asked. "Any vulnerability in the evidence?" Stephen considered this. The only enhancement would be establishing clearer motive, something that explicitly connects their relationship to the financial strategy. Right now, a skilled attorney could potentially argue these are separate issues, the affair being personal, while the financial manipulations were just poor judgment. His observation highlighted the final piece I needed: definitive proof that their relationship and financial planning were coordinated parts of a single strategy rather than coincidental parallel developments. The opportunity came 3 weeks later through an unexpected source. My mother called, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Kristin, I think you should know that Bianca came by yesterday asking very specific questions about your grandmother's trust. When distributions occur, how marriage length affects eligibility, whether divorce would impact your portion. She claimed you had asked her to gather information because you were too busy. I know that's not something you would do." The protective anger in my mother's voice was palpable. "I told her I wasn't comfortable discussing family financial matters without you present." She got unusually defensive. "What exactly did she say?" I asked, recording our conversation with my mother's knowledge and consent. "She said I should be prepared for significant family changes soon, and that she was just trying to make the transition smoother for everyone." When I pressed her, she mentioned that you and Laurence have been struggling more than you've let on, and that your work commitments have put serious strain on your marriage. My mother paused, her voice hardening. "I've watched you build your business while maintaining your marriage for 9 years. I've seen how you balance everything, how you make time for family despite your success. So I told her I didn't believe her." "How did she respond to that?" I asked. She said, and I'm quoting directly because it stunned me, "Mom, sometimes relationships evolve in ways we don't expect. After the divorce, everyone will need to adjust to new arrangements." She said it with such certainty, Kristin, as if it was already decided. This conversation provided the final connection I needed: direct evidence that Bianca was actively gathering financial information related to my inheritance while simultaneously advancing the divorce narrative. The timing, coming just weeks before my parents' anniversary dinner where Laurence planned to announce our separation, suggested coordination rather than coincidence. I thanked my mother for her loyalty and insight, assuring her I would handle the situation. After our call, I added the recording to my evidence file and completed the presentation I had been developing, a comprehensive timeline linking their relationship development directly to key financial decisions and inheritance triggers. With this final piece in place, I scheduled the emails to be sent during my parents' anniversary dinner, timed to arrive moments after I expected Laurence to make his announcement. Each recipient would receive information specifically relevant to how they had been manipulated, with the full context available to anyone who wanted to understand the complete picture. As I finalized these preparations, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. The anxiety that had accompanied months of discovery and documentation was replaced by certainty. I wasn't reacting emotionally to betrayal. I was responding strategically to a coordinated attack on my life, relationships, and assets. They had underestimated me in the most fundamental way possible, believing that my professional skills somehow existed separately from my personal awareness, that I could identify complex security threats for multinational corporations, but miss them in my own home. The irony was almost elegant. The very characteristics that made me valuable as a security consultant, methodical analysis, pattern recognition, comprehensive documentation, made me the worst possible target for their particular form of betrayal. After obtaining the final evidence I needed, I faced a critical decision about my approach to exposing Laurence and Bianca's betrayal. A conventional confrontation, tears, accusations, ultimatums, would play directly into their narrative of me as emotionally unstable and work-obsessed. More importantly, it would give them the opportunity to control how our families and social circle perceived the situation. I needed a strategy that would prevent them from reframing the evidence or managing the fallout on their terms. My professional experience offered clear guidance. When revealing a sophisticated security breach, comprehensive disclosure is more effective than incremental revelation. Showing the full pattern of compromise simultaneously leaves no room for alternative explanations or damage control. My first step was consulting with Diana Reynolds, a divorce attorney known for handling high-conflict cases involving financial deception. I presented my evidence with the same organized methodology I would use for a client security assessment. "This is remarkable documentation," Diana said, reviewing the timeline I had constructed. "Most clients bring me suspicions and tearful accounts. You've brought me a complete forensic analysis. What should I expect if I proceed with divorce?" I asked. Diana was forthright in her assessment. "With what you've provided, we can protect most of your assets and potentially pursue claims related to financial misrepresentation. Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, so the court will consider factors like deception when dividing property." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "But legal remedies won't address the personal and social dimensions. Courts can divide assets, but they can't correct narratives. If maintaining your reputation and relationships matters to you, that requires a different approach altogether." Her words crystallized my thinking. This wasn't just about protecting financial assets. It was about preserving the truth of my marriage, family relationships, and professional standing against a deliberate campaign to rewrite them. "I'm not interested in revenge," I clarified. "I want comprehensive correction of the false narrative they've been constructing." Diana nodded with professional understanding. "Then your timing and presentation will be as important as the evidence itself." With legal guidance established, I turned to practical preparation. I secured our most important financial accounts, changing access credentials and establishing monitoring alerts. I copied essential documents, backed up digital records to secure locations, and placed heirlooms and irreplaceable items in safe storage. I also prepared for potential counter-narratives. If Laurence claimed I had fabricated evidence, I ensured everything was authenticated and time-stamped. If he suggested I had been monitoring him out of paranoia rather than legitimate concern, I documented the chronology showing my investigation began after discovering concrete evidence of deception. The most challenging aspect was maintaining normal interactions while these preparations proceeded. Each morning I would kiss Laurence goodbye, knowing he was communicating with Bianca throughout the day. Each family gathering I would engage with my sister, aware of her systematic betrayal. I participated in discussions about future plans, renovations to our home, potential vacation destinations, retirement strategies. Recognizing these conversations were performances rather than genuine planning. This period of dual consciousness was professionally informative, but emotionally draining. I found myself approaching personal interactions with the same hypervigilance I applied to threat assessment in my work. Every conversation became an exercise in information management, revealing enough to maintain normalcy while protecting my awareness of their deception. 3 weeks before my parents' anniversary dinner, I overheard Laurence on a private call, confirming what I had already suspected. He planned to announce our separation at the gathering, presenting it as a mutual decision resulting from growing apart. The timing was strategic, using a celebration of my parents' enduring marriage as backdrop for revealing the failure of mine, ensuring maximum family support during the difficult transition. What he didn't know was that I had already prepared my response to this performance. I had compiled individual dossiers for each family member and close friend, containing only the information relevant to how they had been manipulated by Laurence and Bianca. For my father, evidence of how Laurence had discussed accessing trust funds without my knowledge. For my mother, documentation of Bianca's staged concerns about my mental state. For each person they had deceived, precise records of the specific lies told. These materials were organized into separate emails, scheduled for delivery during the dinner, with a master file containing the complete timeline available to anyone who wanted the full context. The presentation was clinical rather than emotional, focusing on documented facts rather than my personal feelings about the betrayal. "This approach seems almost corporate," my friend Esme commented when I outlined the strategy to her. "Are you sure this is how you want to handle something so personal?" "It's precisely because it's personal that I need to be methodical," I explained. "Emotions are exactly what they're expecting and prepared to manage. Facts presented clearly are much harder to dismiss or reframe." As the anniversary dinner approached, Laurence's behavior confirmed my assessment. He became increasingly attentive, suggesting weekend activities together and initiating conversations about our future. These gestures weren't reconciliation, attempts but groundwork for the narrative he planned to present. The caring husband who had tried everything to save a failing marriage. "I've been thinking," he said the weekend before the dinner, his tone carefully calibrated to sound contemplative rather than rehearsed. "We should make time for a real conversation soon about where we're heading. It feels like we've been on parallel paths lately rather than a shared journey." I noted the phrasing. Parallel paths. Shared journey. Language that established emotional distance without specific complaints. Perfect for someone planning to cite irreconcilable differences rather than admit to an affair with his wife's sister. "You're right," I agreed, matching his performative sincerity. "There's a lot we should discuss." The night before the dinner, I finalized my preparations. The emails were scheduled, the evidence organized, the timing coordinated. I selected my outfit carefully, a blue dress Laurence had complimented often, subtle makeup, my grandmother's pearl earrings. I would appear exactly as expected, the successful professional woman balancing career and family, unaware of the dramatic announcement planned for the evening. That night, as Laurence slept beside me, I experienced a moment of clarity about what I was truly defending. This wasn't just about exposing their affair or protecting my assets. It was about maintaining the integrity of truth itself. They had constructed an elaborate fiction, revising history and manipulating perceptions. My response wasn't vengeance but restoration, replacing their carefully crafted narrative with documented reality. The morning of the dinner brought a final confirmation of their coordination. While Laurence was showering, his phone chimed with a message from Bianca. "Everything set for tonight. Mom seemed concerned when I mentioned you might have an announcement. Convinced her it's for the best. Remember to emphasize growing apart, not differences. Sounds less blameworthy." His response was immediate. "Presentation prepared. Meeting you after to celebrate moving forward. After the divorce, we'll have it all." The exact phrase from the text that had started my investigation months ago. After the divorce, we'll have it all. The circular completion of their planning, returning to the core motivation that had driven every calculated move. I left the house before Laurence, claiming I needed to pick up my parents' anniversary gift. In reality, I needed the solitude to prepare mentally for the evening ahead. I drove to a park overlooking the Connecticut River and sat watching the water flow, considering the irrevocable nature of the step I was about to take. Once I revealed, What I knew, there would be no return to previous relationships. My marriage would definitively end. My relationship with my sister would be permanently altered. Family dynamics would shift in ways impossible to fully predict. Yet maintaining the deception was not an option. Allowing their fiction to become accepted reality would mean surrendering not just assets, but the truth of my own life story. Some principles transcended even marriage and family loyalty. Honesty about fundamental relationships was one of them. As I drove to my parents' home that evening, I felt an unusual sense of peace. For months, I had been living in two realities: the facade of my marriage and the truth of its compromise. After tonight, there would be only one reality, painful but authentic. I arrived precisely on time, gift in hand, prepared for the final act in a performance that had run far longer than anyone realized. The evening ahead would reveal which narrative would prevail, their carefully constructed fiction or my methodically documented truth. Living with knowledge of Laurence and Bianca's betrayal while gathering evidence required a performance worthy of professional actors. Each morning I would wake beside my husband, exchange pleasantries over breakfast, and kiss him goodbye, all while carrying the weight of what I knew. The cognitive dissonance was extraordinary, maintaining the appearance of an unknowing wife while methodically documenting the collapse of my marriage. This double life demanded unprecedented compartmentalization. During business hours, I advised clients on protecting their most valuable assets, identifying security vulnerabilities, and developing response strategies for potential breaches. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was simultaneously applying these exact skills to my personal life, treating my marriage as a compromised system requiring forensic analysis. The most challenging aspects were family gatherings where both Laurence and Bianca were present. Sunday brunches became exercises in controlled observation. I would watch their interactions with new awareness, noting the lingering glances, the unnecessary touches, the synchronized arrivals and departures. Their performance was polished from months of practice, but once I knew what to look for, their coordination was almost painfully obvious. "You two seem to be getting along better," my father commented during one such gathering, nodding toward Laurence and Bianca deep in conversation by the kitchen counter. "They've developed quite a bond," I replied neutrally, watching Lawrence's hand briefly touch my sister's back when he thought no one was looking. These moments of witnessing their deception without revealing my awareness were strangely empowering. While they believed they were maintaining perfect secrecy, I was compiling a comprehensive record of their betrayal. The knowledge that I controlled when and how this information would be revealed gave me a sense of agency during a period when much had been taken from me. There were close calls. Once, Laurence nearly discovered my documentation when he used my laptop while his was charging. I had created an encrypted folder that required specific credentials, but the momentary panic reminded me of the stakes involved. Another time, Bianca noticed me watching them during a family dinner and quickly adjusted her behavior, becoming conspicuously formal with Laurence for the remainder of the evening. The most difficult test came when Laurence initiated intimacy. One night, something that had become increasingly rare in our marriage. The thought of physical connection with someone actively betraying me was revolting, but rejecting him might signal awareness that something was wrong. I fabricated a migraine, the first deliberate lie I had told in our relationship, a small deception amid their monumental ones. "You've been getting these headaches more frequently," he observed with seemingly genuine concern, bringing me water and medication. "Maybe you should see a specialist." His performance of the caring husband was flawless, making me wonder about the compartmentalization happening in his own mind. How did he reconcile these acts of apparent tenderness with his systematic betrayal? Could he genuinely believe he was justified in his actions? Or was this calculated manipulation to maintain his cover? Throughout this period, I continued building my case with clinical precision. Each week brought new evidence: financial records showing patterns of concealment, text messages revealing coordination of their narrative, recordings of conversations where they manipulated others' perceptions of me. I organized everything chronologically, creating a timeline that demonstrated not just their affair, but their comprehensive strategy to maximize gain at my expense. As my documentation grew more complete, I found myself analyzing them with professional detachment rather than personal hurt. Their betrayal became a case study in social engineering, using established trust to bypass normal security measures, manipulating emotional responses to distract from logical inconsistencies, creating plausible alternative narratives to explain suspicious patterns. The most revealing discoveries came from monitoring how they adapted their strategy over time. When I mentioned potentially reducing my work travel, Laurence quickly encouraged several family members to express concern about my obsession with work, reinforcing the narrative that my career focus was damaging our marriage. When I suggested a weekend getaway for our anniversary, Bianca suddenly developed scheduling conflicts that required Laurence's assistance, establishing patterns that would support their story of growing emotional connection through mutual support. 2 months into my surveillance, I reached a critical threshold where additional evidence became redundant. I had comprehensively documented their relationship, financial maneuvers, and narrative development. The remaining question wasn't what they were doing, but how I would respond when the moment came to reveal what I knew. As my parents' anniversary dinner approached, the event Laurence had selected for his announcement, I finalized my preparations. Files were organized, emails drafted, evidence secured in multiple locations. I had moved from information gathering to strategic planning, from passive documentation to active response. The strange duality of this period, knowing the truth while performing ignorance, had transformed me. I approached the coming confrontation, not with the emotional devastation they expected, but with the clarity of someone who had already processed the betrayal and moved beyond it to decisive action. The week before my parents' anniversary dinner, I entered the final phase of preparation. While Laurence perfected his announcement speech and coordinated last-minute details with Bianca, I was engaged in equally meticulous planning of a very different kind. My first priority was ensuring the evidence couldn't be destroyed or denied. I created 3 separate backups of all digital materials, one in an encrypted cloud storage accessible only with multi-factor authentication, one on a secured external drive stored in my office safe, and one with my attorney under legal privilege. Protection. For critical documents, I made certified copies with verification timestamps. Next came the presentation structure. Rather than a raw data dump that might overwhelm recipients, I organized the evidence into clear categories: financial deception, timeline of the affair, coordinated narrative manipulation, and planned future actions. Each section began with a summary of key findings followed by supporting documentation arranged chronologically. The most challenging aspect was deciding what information each person should receive. I created a matrix mapping each family member and close friend against specific instances where they had been manipulated by Laurence or Bianca. My parents would receive the most comprehensive file, including evidence of how their trust had been exploited to gather financial information. Extended family would get more focused packages highlighting how they had been used to validate the false narrative of our failing marriage. "This is extraordinarily thorough," Diana commented during our final review. "In 15 years of divorce practice, I've never seen someone approach betrayal with this level of systematic documentation." "It's how I process difficult information," I explained. "Breaking it into analyzable components makes it manageable." Diana studied me thoughtfully. "Most clients in your situation are still cycling through grief and rage at this stage. You seem beyond that somehow." "The grieving happened during the investigation," I replied. "Each piece of evidence was a stage in accepting what my marriage had actually become. By the time I had the complete picture, I had already processed most of the emotional impact. This wasn't entirely true. The pain still surfaced in unexpected moments. Sometimes I would find myself staring at wedding photos, wondering if Laurence had been genuine then, or if our entire relationship had been strategic manipulation. Occasionally, childhood memories with Bianca would emerge, making me question how someone who had shared so much of my life could betray me so completely. But these moments of emotional vulnerability didn't interfere with my planning. If anything, they reinforced my determination to ensure the truth would be recognized rather than rewritten to serve their purposes. 3 days before the dinner, I made final technical arrangements for the email delivery. The messages were scheduled to deploy simultaneously at 8:15 p.m., the time when dessert would typically be served at my parents' gatherings, and when I anticipated Laurence would make his announcement. Each email was addressed individually with subject lines tailored to ensure immediate attention. Important information about Laurence and Bianca for family members. Professional disclosure regarding the Whitakers for colleagues. My own copy included a comprehensive summary I could reference during the inevitable questions that would follow. I memorized key dates and details, anticipating attempts to dismiss the evidence as misinterpreted or exaggerated. Preparation for counter-arguments was as important as the evidence itself. I needed to be ready for any attempt to undermine the credibility of what I had discovered. The day before the dinner, I visited my grandmother in her assisted living facility. Though her memory had grown fragile, she recognized me immediately, her eyes brightening as I entered her room. "There's my clever girl," she said, patting the chair beside her. "Tell me what remarkable things you've been doing." I sat with her for an hour, discussing simple things: the changing leaves, a book I was reading, memories of summers at the lake house. I deliberately avoided mentioning the impending dissolution of my marriage or Bianca's betrayal. Those revelations would come to her through my parents, filtered with appropriate sensitivity for her condition. As I prepared to leave, she took my hand with surprising strength. "Something's troubling you," she said, her gaze momentarily sharp and focused. "Remember what I told you when you were small? Steel in the spine, fire in the heart." It was her favorite expression, her response whenever life had dealt me disappointments or challenges. The unexpected reminder of her wisdom brought tears to my eyes. "I remember," I assured her. "I'm putting it into practice tomorrow." On the morning of the dinner, I performed a final verification of all systems. The emails were queued and ready. My secure folder contained backups of everything. The presentation on my phone was accessible with a single command. I had prepared for every contingency I could anticipate: technical failures, premature confrontation, attempts to dismiss or reframe the evidence. As I dressed for the evening, selecting the blue dress and pearl earrings that represented continuity with the woman I had been before discovering the betrayal, I experienced a moment of perfect clarity. This wasn't just about exposing their deception or protecting my assets. It was about preserving the integrity of truth itself against a deliberate campaign to distort it. I checked my appearance one last time before leaving for my parents' house. The woman in the mirror looked composed, determined, and somehow lighter, as if the burden of carrying hidden knowledge was already lifting in anticipation of its release. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, I would no longer be living in the shadow of their deception. With that thought, I gathered my purse, the anniversary gift, and my resolve, and headed toward the reckoning that had been months in the making. I arrived at my parents' colonial home precisely at 6:30, timing my entrance to appear neither suspiciously early nor deliberately late. My father greeted me with a warm hug in the foyer, the familiar scent of his aftershave momentarily transporting me to simpler times. My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an embroidered towel, her face lighting up despite the tension I knew she had been carrying since our conversation about Bianca's inheritance inquiries. "There she is," she said, embracing me tightly. "Right on time, as always." I presented them with their anniversary gift, a custom photo album chronicling their 40 years together, ironically compiled with Laurence's help months earlier when our own marriage still appeared intact. The thoughtfulness of the gift would soon stand in stark contrast to the announcement Laurence planned to make. The house gradually filled with family members. Aunt Renee arrived with her signature lemon tart. My cousins Monica and Stephen came together, already bantering about some long-standing sibling disagreement. Each arrival reinforced what was at stake. Not just my marriage, but the stability of an entire family structure about to be deliberately destabilized by Laurence and Bianca's revelation. They arrived separately, of course, a final performance of their supposed distance. Bianca entered first, carrying wine and flowers, greeting everyone with heightened enthusiasm that I now recognized as nervousness. Laurence followed 20 minutes later, apologizing for a work call that couldn't wait, though my monitoring had confirmed he'd been parked around the corner coordinating final details with Bianca via text. Throughout the pre-dinner mingling, I observed them with analytical detachment. They maintained appropriate physical distance while exchanging subtle glances and occasionally checking their phones in synchronized patterns. Both appeared slightly more formal than usual, Bianca in an uncharacteristically conservative dress, Laurence wearing the navy blazer he reserved for important client meetings. As we moved to the dining room, Laurence maneuvered to sit directly across from me, positioning Bianca 3 seats away, close enough for visual communication but not so near as to raise suspicions. My father took his place at the head of the table, my mother opposite him, surrounded by the family they had built together across 4 decades of genuine partnership. "Before we begin," my father said, raising his glass, "I want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate 40 years with this extraordinary woman." He smiled at my mother with undiminished affection. "Through every challenge and triumph, she has been my true north, my best friend, and the love of my life." The sincerity of his words hung in the air, a poignant counterpoint to the manufactured announcement Laurence was preparing to deliver. As glasses clinked and conversation flowed, I felt an almost anthropological interest in the social dynamics unfolding, the authentic celebration about to be hijacked for a carefully staged performance. Dinner progressed through my mother's signature courses: summer salad with berries, herb-crusted rack of lamb, roasted vegetables from their garden. I participated in conversations automatically, offering appropriate responses while monitoring Laurence's increasing signs of anticipation. The slight flush creeping up his neck, the repeated glances toward Bianca, the careful moderation of his wine consumption to remain clear-headed. As my mother brought out dessert, individual lemon soufflés with fresh blueberries, Laurence cleared his throat and gently tapped his water glass with a spoon. The familiar sound silenced conversation. Around the table, all eyes turning toward him expectantly, "I have something important to share with everyone," he began, his voice projecting practiced sincerity. The room quieted completely, creating the attentive audience he had planned for. I glanced at my watch. 8:13 p.m., almost exactly when I had anticipated this moment would arrive. "Kristin and I have been going through some changes," he continued, his gaze momentarily meeting mine before shifting away. "We've decided to separate and begin divorce proceedings." The reactions were immediate. My mother's sharp intake of breath, my father's furrowed brow, Aunt Renee's hand moving to cover her heart. Exactly the response he had orchestrated, creating the emotional backdrop for his narrative of mutual growth and inevitable parting. "It's been a difficult decision," Laurence added, his voice gaining confidence. "But we both feel it's for the best. We've grown apart in ways that can't be reconciled." I remained silent, my expression neutral, allowing him to continue building the fiction he had rehearsed so carefully. From the corner of my eye, I could see Bianca staring intently at her dessert, her knuckles white around her fork, waiting for her cue in this performance. "There's more," Laurence said, exactly as I had predicted he would. "After some time has passed and the divorce is finalized." "Before you continue," I interrupted calmly, "I think everyone should check their phones. I just sent an important email." Confusion flickered across Laurence's face, the first genuine expression I had seen. From him in months. What email? I sent it right before dessert, I replied, pulling out my own phone. Everyone should have received it by now. Around the table, family members hesitantly reached for their phones. Monica was the first to open the message, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the contents. My father followed, his expression darkening with each swipe of his finger. Kristin, what is this? Bianca hissed, her face draining of color as she stared at her screen. It's just documentation, I said evenly. Something I've become quite skilled at over the past few months. The atmosphere in the room transformed as each person processed the contents of their email. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated announcement by Laurence was now a revelation of an entirely different kind. I watched as expressions shifted from confusion to shock to anger. Not directed at me as Laurence and Bianca had planned, but squarely at them. These text messages, my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper as she scrolled through her phone. Bianca, you actually wrote these things about your sister? About planning to take her inheritance? Laurence attempted damage control, his professional composure surfacing as he tried to regain command of the situation. Everyone, please. This is clearly Kristin's way of processing a difficult transition. Some of these messages are being taken completely out of context. Which context would that be, Laurence? My father interrupted, his voice ice cold. The context where you discussed my daughter's inheritance with her sister while planning to divorce her? The context where you deliberately timed this to maximize financial gain? Bianca shifted to tears, her reliable strategy when confronted. I never meant to hurt anyone, she sobbed, reaching for her napkin. It just happened. You can't control who you fall in love with. According to these messages, Monica countered, holding up her phone, you've been planning this for over 2 years. That's not just happening. That's calculated deception. The chorus of condemnation grew as more family members processed what they were reading. My Aunt Renee had moved to sit beside my mother, one arm around her shoulders. Stephen was asking pointed questions about the financial documentation included in his email. The carefully constructed narrative of amicable separation was collapsing under the weight of irrefutable evidence. I remained silent, allowing the natural consequences to unfold. After months of investigation, documentation, and preparation, there was nothing more I needed to say. The evidence spoke for itself, clear, comprehensive, and devastating. How? Did you get all this? Laurence finally asked, his voice hollow as he scrolled through his phone, seeing the extent of what I had compiled. I'm a security consultant, I replied simply. I identify vulnerabilities and document breaches. It's what I do every day. The realization dawned in his eyes. He had completely underestimated me, dismissing my professional skills as somehow separate from my personal awareness. The profound misjudgment at the core of their plan was now evident to everyone in the room. Bianca made one final attempt to salvage their narrative. Kristin, we never wanted it to happen this way, she said, tears streaming down her face. Things just evolved between us. We were going to tell you privately before tonight, but according to your texts from last month, I interrupted calmly, you both decided a public announcement would limit her ability to react dramatically. You specifically discussed using this dinner as the ideal setting because family support would contain any potential scene. The precision of the quote silenced her completely. Around the table, family members continued reading, occasionally sharing particularly damning excerpts with each other, the full scope of the betrayal becoming increasingly clear. I gathered my purse and stood. I should go, I said quietly. Dad, Mom, I'm sorry about your anniversary dinner. My father rose immediately. I'll walk you out. Outside in the cool evening air, he embraced me fiercely. I had no idea what you've been dealing with, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Why didn't you tell us sooner? I needed to understand it completely first, I explained. And I needed everyone else to understand it too, not just believe me. He nodded, studying my face with new awareness. What happens now? Legally, it's straightforward. The divorce will proceed, but with significantly different terms than they planned. Personally, I paused, considering the landscape ahead. I'll rebuild, one day at a time. As I drove away, my phone lit up with messages from family members, expressions of shock, support, and solidarity. I turned it off, welcoming the silence and the first moment of complete honesty I had experienced in months. The next morning, I contacted Diana to initiate formal divorce proceedings. When she asked if I wanted to pursue punitive measures regarding the financial deception, I considered carefully. I'm not interested in punishment, I decided. I want fair resolution based on the truth rather than their fictional narrative. Beyond that, the natural consequences of their actions will be sufficient. Those consequences manifested quickly. My parents, once Bianca's most reliable supporters, established clear boundaries regarding her access to family gatherings and resources. Friends who had been manipulated into believing our marriage was failing through my neglect now understood the deliberate campaign of deception behind that perception. Professionally, Laurence faced uncomfortable questions about ethics and judgment from colleagues who had received documentation of his planned financial maneuvers. 3 months later, as I signed the final divorce papers in Diana's office, I felt not satisfaction but completion, the closing of a chapter that had unexpectedly transformed me. Most clients feel either vindicated or devastated at this moment, Diana observed, watching me review the settlement terms. You seem neither. I feel clear, I replied after considering her observation. For months I lived in a distorted reality they created. Now I'm standing firmly in the truth again. That evening, I walked through my new apartment overlooking the Connecticut River. The space was smaller than the Victorian home I had shared with Laurence, but it was entirely mine, decorated according to my preferences, organized to support my work and interests, free from the shadow of deception that had permeated our shared spaces. On the balcony, watching the river flow past, I opened my laptop and deleted the investigation files, the final step in a process that had consumed nearly a year of my life. The evidence had served its purpose, establishing truth against deliberate fiction. Preserving it further would only anchor me to a past that no longer required my attention. My phone chimed with a message from Esme, checking if I was still joining her for dinner the following evening. The simple normality of the invitation, friends, sharing a meal, no hidden agendas, brought an unexpected smile to my face. I confirmed the plans, then set the phone aside to enjoy the sunset. Tomorrow would be the first page of a new chapter, one written entirely in my own hand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.